Welcome to Unit 4, Learning to Read and Write in a Changing World. In this lecture, we focus on how people learn to read and write, the dominant approaches, and their benefits and drawbacks. We consider issues related to adult literacy in Canada, and the ways in which access to literacy skills is shaped by past and present patterns of discrimination, as well as access to literacy sponsors, a concept from Unit 3. These ideas are taken up in your readings for this unit, which center on the idea that literacy can be both a tool of oppression and a tool of empowerment. A first important thing for educators to remember is that there are many pathways to literacy. There is not one best or ideal way to learn to read and write, and indeed we are learning new literacies and new ways to read and write throughout our lives. Most people learn to read and write as children and build on these skills throughout their lives. But many people also come to literacy as adults, for a variety of reasons we will explore later in this lecture. Another important point is that schools are not the only place where people learn to read. And there are a variety of ways in which people have learned to read in school and outside of school. Some have learned through memorization, rote, and repetitive practice using phonics. Some people remember being hit or shamed or embarrassed during reading. Others have learned through stories, through play, and learning to read whole text first, like as a whole language approach. What is your memory of reading? And how does this memory of reading shape your views and your attitudes toward literacy today? Many people, as we will talk about later, did not learn to read in school. Perhaps there was inappropriate instruction. Maybe they didn't have time to go to school, or there were other expectations placed on them. Sometimes there are cultural biases against women or girls going to school. Many people, however, although they did not learn to read in school, have learned to read outside of school. Indeed, there are many pathways to literacy. What is involved in learning to read and write? Reading is more than decoding words on a page. Many people today believe it's about interpretation, fluency, or being able to read and get meaning from the text quite quickly. It's about critical thinking, choosing information carefully. It's also about understanding the oral language represented in the writing. As one author, Denny Taylor, says, there is reading and then there is really reading. The powerful literacies associated with critical thinking and reading for meaning and reading quickly and being able to select relevant information, making judgments about its value and so on, require lots of practice. Children and adults need a lot of access to literacy resources in order to acquire powerful literacies. They need access to books, computers. They need time, role models, exciting learning opportunities. These literacy sponsors or resources are not evenly distributed in our society, and so some people acquire powerful literacies and others don't. Let's explore this idea a little bit more of what's involved in learning to read and write. Read these two passages. Which is easier? Why? Okay, now that you've read the two passages, what is the role of vocabulary knowledge and familiarity with specialist terms and jargon in your understanding of these texts? Could you read the medical text on the right? If you could read it, could you understand it? What is the difference between reading and understanding? This example illustrates that oral language and also understanding the specialist vocabulary associated with different kinds of literacies is vital to learning to read. Literacy is about much more than simply decoding text. As Margaret Meek has said, we teach what we think reading is. What do you think reading is? The way reading is taught in schools reflects our theory of reading. A common belief is that reading involves first and foremost sounding out letters and decoding the print. This is attached to what we call a bottom-up approach to reading. The goals in this approach are to teach the mastery of the smallest units of language, phonemes, first, and then work steadily up. In this view, it's believed that children and adults must first learn the alphabet letters, then their sounds, then the blends, and then whole words, and then sentences, and so on, until they are able to read full texts. The assumption then is that people cannot read fluently until they have mastered phonics, matching sounds to symbols. This is what we call the bottom-up literacy instruction approach. Here's an example of what this approach looks like. Does this look familiar? Did you learn to read by matching the letters with the words? It's certainly extremely important and vital to literacy to be able to understand and decode print. But it's not necessarily true, some people believe, that this must be the starting point. Rather, the knowledge of phonics, what we call print-based awareness or print-based decoding, can go alongside other kinds of important skills in reading. For example, in the top-down literacy instruction approach, literacy is not just about reading, but also writing. Literacy is linked to reading whole texts for meaning, and these texts should reflect people's lives and languages. Whether they're children or adults, people who believe in what we call the top-down or whole language approach would argue that the whole purpose for reading is to find meaning in the world, and the purpose for writing is to make meaning in the world, and that we shouldn't get bogged down with memorizing letters and sounds too much. The belief here, too, is that children and adults learn to read by exposure and immersion to rich oral and written language experiences, both at home and at school. The belief is that people learn best with material that is interesting, relevant, and challenging to them. So teachers need to learn about the lives of their students in order to bring in texts that they will want to read and need to read in their lives. So, bottom-up and top-down approaches to instruction are best or most successful when they work together in an integrated way. What Pat Campbell, a literacy educator, terms a balanced approach. Both print-based and meaning-based, in other words, both phonics and whole language approaches are important. But the goal should always be to make meaning, to be able to think critically about what we read, and to see ourselves as people whose ideas matter, and who can also produce texts. Indeed, there can be no readers without writers. Take a minute to jot down what you think literacy is. What are your beliefs about reading? How does this shape your work right now, perhaps, as a university student, or a teacher, or someone who's hoping to become a teacher? Understanding and getting a good sense of what your philosophy is about literacy is really important if you're going to have a sound idea or a sound knowledge of how you'd like to teach literacy. Let's consider now the idea of adult literacies. In the introduction to this lecture, we mentioned that many adults do not learn to read and write in childhood. There are many reasons for this. Many adults in our society struggle with reading and writing for a variety of reasons, such as interrupted schooling. Perhaps they had to move around a lot. Perhaps they had to leave school early. Many people have undiagnosed learning difficulties, or sometimes we call them disabilities. People with learning disabilities are often made to feel stupid. Everyone can learn, but because they don't learn in the same way as most kids or adults, they begin to think that they're stupid, that there's something wrong with them. When we lose our self-esteem, we also lose our ability and our desire to read and to be part of a literacy classroom. In this way, many people have struggles with reading and writing because of inappropriate or inadequate instruction. They just didn't get the kinds of instruction that they needed. In many parts of the world, and in Canada too, there's also a lack of access to quality education and to the kinds of literacy resources we mentioned earlier. Access to books, rich learning opportunities, and time. Importantly, also people to help us. Literacy is social. When we want to develop and learn literacy skills, we need people to help us. Cultural and religious beliefs, such as ideas that sanction the education of women and girls, have also played a very important role in adult literacy in Canada and elsewhere. Importantly, too, many newcomers to Canada have lived in countries that have been war-torn. They may have lived in refugee camps or in communities that did not have functioning schooling systems. Indeed, there are many adults in Canada who have never had a formal education. The dominant view in an adult literacy perspective is that people are either low literate or high literate. But in reality, people are literate in different ways and in different settings. Remember the stock market? Can you use literacies to run a fishing rig in a storm and calculate the cost of your catch? Do you know how to build a house? Can you cook a meal for 100 family members? All these require literacy knowledge. But when we get to needing a qualification, say at university, we need to pass a test or learn a new skill. We often need instruction, access to quality literacy instruction to help us make changes in our lives and enjoy the new life roles that are before us. Access to literacy instruction is really important in a democratic society. Although in Canada, this area of education is neglected, an issue that has attracted criticism from international bodies such as the Organization of Economic and Cooperative Development, OECD, and the United Nations, or UNESCO. The problem is that while many people will advocate for children's right to learn, who will advocate for adults' right to learn? Nevertheless, there are many very talented and exciting literacy educators and programs in Canada, and you're going to explore their work more in Unit 5. Another important factor in adult literacy in Canada is our colonial history and the history of the residential schools. This is an important topic in Unit 4. Residential schools existed in Canada between 1862 and 1996. It was a partnership between the Canadian government and religious groups, Catholic and Protestant, to remove Aboriginal children from their families and communities and educate them in schools, many far from their parents, and much of the time without necessarily their parents' permission, although sometimes parents did give permission, although they might not have known what they were getting into. Literacy in one's first language, what we call mother tongue, is vital to learning to read and write, but it is also central to cultural and social identity, to who we are as people. Literacy in Aboriginal languages was forbidden in residential schools. This was to achieve the goals of the schools, to erase Aboriginal culture and knowledge, to assimilate Aboriginal children and adults into Canadian culture. Because Aboriginal culture, languages, and literacies were not seen as valuable or relevant to Canadian values and our economy. Instead, these so-called Canadian values were deemed as a better replacement for Aboriginal values. A second goal, besides assimilation, of residential schools was to create a pool of cheap labor, the drawers of wood, the hewers of water, to do the low-skilled work that settlers did not want to do. You see in this picture small children learning to sew and indeed vocational or skills were the core of residential school curriculum. Certainly not the powerful literacies of reading and writing that other Canadian children were learning in school. So literacy can be used as a weapon, as a tool of oppression. But as you will read in the core reading for this unit, to First Nations mothers, it is also a means to reclaim identity and lost knowledge. And literacy then is a way to pass on knowledge to future generations. Certainly, as Aboriginal literacies thrive and develop today, they are playing a very important role in reclaiming Aboriginal identities. And importantly, land and economic rights. So in conclusion, there are many pathways to literacy. Some people learn to read and write in school. Some people don't. Some people learn through whole language and enriched methods, and others have learned through phonics. Some people have terrible memories of learning to read and write. Others can't even remember a day when they weren't reading and writing. Our pathways to literacy are shaped by our access to resources for literacy, to really good instruction, to literacy sponsors, role models, opportunities, and tools that help us with literacy along the way. In this way, as we said, adults who want to improve or enhance their literacy skills should have access to literacy instruction to help them do this, to help them move along with their lives. This is a vital and important part of democracy. Why should some people have access to this important resource and others not? In this way, the residential school experience reminds us that race, gender, and class discrimination shapes people's access to literacy. And, just as we discussed in Unit 2, the past always shapes the present. In this way, effective educators must find out about people's lives and make connections to the literacies they need. We shouldn't think that we need to follow a rote curriculum, starting with the letters and the sounds, if you will. Instead, we need to engage with our students, whether they're children or adults, find out what it is that's important for them, and help them, as a literacy sponsor, gain access to those resources, gain access to those literacy skills that they want and need.